Story 1. I'll never forget that night. It was late, maybe 10 or 11 p.m. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted. I live in a small suburban neighborhood where nothing exciting happens, so I didn't think much of being alone at home. My mom and brother were in their rooms, probably watching TV or on their phones. The house was quiet, just how I liked it after a long day. I tossed my bag on the couch and headed straight to my room. The streetlights outside cast a dim, orangish glow through my bedroom window. It wasn't much, but it gave just enough light to navigate without turning on the lamp. I was in the middle of changing, peeling off my work shirt and rummaging through a drawer for a t-shirt, when something made my stomach knot. It wasn't a sound, not really, but more like a shift in the atmosphere. That weird sixth sense you get when you're being watched. I glanced at the window, more out of reflex than real concern. At first I saw my reflection, but then behind it, a face, a man's face. I froze. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. His face was pale, ghostly almost, pressed up against the glass. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and locked on me. For a second I thought I was imagining it, but then his head moved slightly and I realized this was real. My knees buckled and I dropped to the floor, heart hammering like a drum. I didn't even think. I just rolled to the side and slapped the light switch off. Darkness swallowed the room, and I crouched there on the carpet, breathing so hard I thought he could hear me. "Holy shit," I whispered to myself, barely audible. My hands fumbled for my shirt, trying to pull it on as quietly as I could. Every second stretched into eternity. The window was still in my line of sight, and though I couldn't see his face anymore, I kept watching. Maybe he left. Maybe I scared him off by turning off the light. But then, something else appeared. A camera. No face now, just a camera lens pointed directly at me, its faint red light glowing like a predator's eye in the dark. My breath caught in my throat, my skin prickled with cold sweat. I didn't wait to figure out what was happening. I bolted. I didn't even grab my shoes. I yanked my door open and ran into the hallway shouting, "Mom! Mom!" My voice cracked from sheer panic. What's wrong?" she called back alarmed as she came out of her room. "There's someone outside my window," I stammered, my words tumbling over each other. "A man, he had a camera." My brother Jake stormed out of his room, already pulling on a hoodie. "Where?" he demanded, his face set in anger. "The backyard," I managed, my voice shaking. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed a flashlight and sprinted toward the back door. My mom tried to hold me, to calm me down, but I couldn't stand still. I followed Jake to the back porch, peering out into the yard. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I barely noticed. Our backyard is fenced in, with a few trees and an old shed near the back. The only way in or out is through the gate or by climbing over. Jake scanned the area with his flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark. And that's when we saw it, the ladder. It was lying on the ground right beneath my window. "Son of a bitch," Jake muttered. He picked it up and inspected it, like it would give him answers. It was our ladder, the one we kept in the shed. The shed door was slightly ajar. "Stay here," Jake ordered, but I didn't listen. I followed him as he crept toward the shed. The flashlight beam wavered as his hand trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. He yanked the shed door open, and we both jumped. It was empty. Nothing but gardening tools and old junk. Whoever had been out there was gone. Jake walked to the fence and shone the light over it. No footprints, no sign of anyone climbing over. It was like they had just vanished into thin air. By the time we went back inside, Mom had already called the police. They came about 20 minutes later, 2 officers who looked more annoyed than concerned. They took my statement, asked Jake a few questions, and walked around the yard with their own flashlights. "There's no sign of forced entry," one of them said. "Might have been some kids messing around. Could have seen the ladder and thought it'd be funny to scare someone." I didn't buy that for a second. That face wasn't a kid trying to be funny. That camera wasn't a prank. After they left, I locked every door and window in the house. Jake stayed up with me for hours, sitting in the living room with a baseball bat resting across his knees. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak, every gust of wind against the window sent my heart racing. I kept replaying it in my mind. The man's face, the camera, the ladder. It felt so deliberate, so planned. The next morning, we found scratch marks on the outside of my window frame, like someone had been trying to pry it open. We never saw the man again, but the image of his face never left me. Story 2. I grew up in a small, creaky house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was home, a place where every floorboard had a voice and every corner held memories. I was 16 when we moved out, my family expanding too fast for the house to keep up. Packing up felt like flipping through a scrapbook of my childhood, every item stirring some story or feeling. On the last day before the big move, nostalgia had me by the throat. I wandered through the empty rooms, running my fingers along walls that had once held my scribbled drawings. Then I remembered the downstairs closet under the stairs. It had been my retreat as a kid, a world of my own where I could read uninterrupted. With nothing else to do, I grabbed a flashlight, pushed open the creaky door, and ducked inside. The closet was deep, like an L-shaped tunnel that twisted into the guts of the house. The first section was tall enough to stand in, but the space beyond the turn was tiny, barely 3 feet high. That's where the old blankets and stuffed animals had been piled up for as long as I could remember, forming a soft, chaotic mound. I crawled in, settling myself among the familiar mess, flashlight in one hand and an old paperback in the other. For a while it was perfect. The house was noisy with my siblings and parents hauling boxes around, but in that cocoon of blankets, it was quiet. I could almost pretend I was 10 again, hiding away with my books, the world beyond the closet irrelevant. Time slipped by, maybe an hour. I lost myself in the pages until my legs started to cramp. I shifted my position, pushing deeper into the pile of blankets, and that's when I heard it. "You always make me happy." The voice was slow, cracked, and warped, like a worn-out cassette tape playing in reverse. It wasn't loud, just a murmur, like someone whispering right into my ear. My chest seized. My first thought was my brother messing with me, but the blankets and stuffed animals around me were undisturbed. My second thought, rational and desperate, was that maybe it was the house settling, a pipe groaning, something explainable. But deep down I knew better. The sound wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was aware. I froze, my body going ice cold, as my brain scrambled for a plan. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand, and the shadows around me seemed to pulse. Then slowly I turned my head toward the dark corner where the voice had come from. There was nothing, just the blankets and a few tattered toys, slumped and forgotten. "You always make me happy," the voice repeated, louder this time, clearer. I couldn't breathe. My pulse thundered in my ears and my muscles locked up like I was a puppet on severed strings. I didn't wait for a third whisper. I scrambled out of that closet, smacking my head on the low ceiling as I went. The flashlight flew from my hand and clattered somewhere behind me, plunging the space into darkness. I clawed at the door, yanking it open so hard it nearly came off its hinges, and I burst into the hallway, gasping for air. "What the hell happened?" my mom asked, staring at me with wide eyes. My siblings paused mid-move, boxes in hand, all of them staring like I'd grown a second head. My voice cracked. "There's something in the closet." The words sounded ridiculous the second they left my mouth, but the terror on my face must have been convincing because my dad grabbed a flashlight and went to check it out. I followed, half of me hoping he'd find something, the other half praying he wouldn't. The closet looked exactly as it always had. The blankets, the toys, the dusty old shelves. My flashlight was sitting on the floor, its beam cutting through the clutter. Dad picked it up and handed it to me with a bemused frown. "There's nothing here," he said. "You probably scared yourself with your own shadow." I wanted to argue, but what could I say? That I'd heard a voice? That something spoke to me? Even I could barely believe it. That night, as the house grew still and my family fell asleep, I found myself sitting in the living room, staring at the closet door from across the hall. The fear hadn't left me. If anything, it had deepened, wrapping itself around me like a second skin. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. The sound of that voice, the way it seemed to creep into my very bones. And the worst part, the part that kept me from shutting my eyes, wasn't just what it said. It was the feeling I'd gotten as I scrambled out of the blankets. The sense that someone was watching me. Something that hadn't wanted me to leave. Story 3. It was a cold, quiet night, and I was home alone in my little one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. I remember the flickering street lamp outside casting strange, jittery shadows on my living room walls as I curled up on the couch, watching some cheesy horror flick. My nerves were already a little on edge. Jump scares had that effect on me. But I wasn't expecting what came next. Hunger hit me like a freight train around midnight, and I realized I hadn't eaten since lunch. There was nothing in the fridge except a few shriveled carrots and some questionable milk, so I decided to make a quick run to Taco Bell. I grabbed my jacket, shoved my phone in my pocket, and headed for the door. That's when it happened. As soon as I turned the knob and pulled the door open, something cold and pale darted into the gap. A hand. Not just any hand. It was long, too long, with bony fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward me, grasping for my arm. For a split second, I froze. The hand didn't belong to anyone I could see. Just an arm, disappearing into the darkness outside my door. Instinct took over. With a guttural scream I didn't know I was capable of, I slammed the door shut as hard as I could, crushing the limb. There was a muffled grunt, but the hand didn't pull back right away. Instead, the fingers clawed at the air, scraping the wood of the doorframe. I shoved my full weight against the door, heart hammering in my chest, and it finally wrenched free. I heard the sound of retreating footsteps, heavy and uneven, fading into the night. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my back pressed to the door, trembling. My mind raced with questions. Who or what had just tried to grab me? What were they doing out there? Were they gone? I bolted the door, locked the chain, and ran to the kitchen. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the butcher knife I grabbed from the drawer. It felt heavy and alien in my grip, but it was the only thing that made me feel remotely safe. I turned off all the lights one by one and crouched in the living room, pulling the blinds shut as quietly as I could. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant car engine, every rustle of the wind outside sent a jolt through my body. Time crawled. I didn't dare move or make a sound. After what must have been an hour, I finally worked up the courage to peek outside. I crept to the window, inching the blind up just enough to see. The street lamp was still flickering, casting its eerie glow on the empty sidewalk. The street was deserted, but there was something else. Something scattered all over the ground just beyond my front steps. I couldn't make it out through the glass, so I slowly unlocked the door, cracking it open just enough to look outside. Menus. There were dozens of Chinese food menus, glossy and bright, littering the ground like oversized confetti. My mind reeled. They hadn't been there earlier. I stepped outside cautiously, knife still clutched tightly in my hand, and bent down to pick one up. Golden Dragon Chinese Cuisine, it read in bold red letters. A phone number was printed at the bottom, along with a grand opening special. I stared at the menu, trying to make sense of it. Why would someone leave these here, especially after that? And then I noticed the blood, a faint streak of red smeared across the edge of the menu, wet and glistening under the street lamp. I dropped it like it had burned me, backing away toward the door. My eyes darted around the street, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I found myself obsessively checking the locks on my door, pacing back and forth, trying to convince myself it had been some kind of weird prank. Maybe a junkie looking for money, or a creepy door-to-door salesman. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I walked to my car, I glanced over my shoulder. Every time I heard a noise outside, I froze, waiting, listening. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but what could I say? That a disembodied hand tried to grab me and left behind a pile of menus? I knew how crazy it sounded. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to call the number on the menu. Part of me thought it might give me some answers, though I wasn't sure what I was expecting. The line rang twice before a cheerful voice answered, Golden Dragon, how can I help you? I hesitated. I got one of your menus. Oh, great, the voice chirped. We're doing a special promotion for the neighborhood. What can I get you? I swallowed hard. Did someone deliver these last night? There was a pause and then the voice laughed lightly. Oh no, we don't deliver yet. You must have picked it up somewhere else. I hung up without saying another word. Story 4. I grew up in a small, quiet suburb in the mid-90s, a place where everyone knew everyone and locks on doors were more symbolic than functional. My brother Aaron and I shared a room in our modest 2-story house. We were inseparable back then, bonded by our shared love for exploring the world of computer games. Saturday mornings were our sacred time. Before the sun climbed high, before our parents even stirred, we'd tiptoe down the creaky stairs, careful not to wake them, and boot up the family computer in the corner of the living room. It was an old, boxy machine, humming and clicking to life as we impatiently waited to dive into our pixelated adventures. This particular Saturday started no differently. Aaron, always the more daring one, nudged me awake. Elliot, come on, let's beat that level today, he whispered, grinning ear to ear. We crept downstairs, giggling under our breath, and turned on the computer. But this time, the familiar startup chime didn't greet us. Instead, the screen remained black for what felt like forever. I was about to suggest we try restarting when a crackling sound, like static from a detuned radio, erupted from the speakers. Then, the screen flickered. At first, it was just a white cursor blinking in the corner. Then words began to appear, letter by letter, as though someone were typing them in real time. Hello, Aaron and Elliot. My heart dropped into my stomach. I stared at Aaron, who looked just as pale as I felt. Is this a joke? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the blood pounding in my ears. Aaron didn't answer. He leaned in closer, his finger hovering over the power button. Before he could press it, the message continued. This is your computer speaking. I am alive. Akimi Dorag. The word alive stretched across the screen, each E dragging out until it filled the monitor. The static sound grew louder, morphing into something that almost resembled a distorted human-like laugh. Turn it off, I hissed, shoving Aaron's hand toward the power button. But before he could, another message appeared. Do not run and tell your parents. They cannot help you now. The room felt colder, the kind of cold that wasn't just physical. It sank into your bones, paralyzing you. Aaron and I froze, unsure of what to do. This had to be some kind of prank, right? Maybe Dad had set it up as a joke, but deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Our parents were the least tech-savvy people on the planet. The screen went blank again, and for a brief moment, I thought it was over. Then the static returned, louder than before, and the screen began displaying images. Quick flashes of things I couldn't fully comprehend. Faces, maybe? Distorted and melting, like wax figures under a blowtorch. A house on fire. A shadowy figure standing at the end of a long hallway. Aaron grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. Elliot, what the hell is this? He stammered. I don't know, I snapped, my voice trembling. Then the final message appeared, the letters blood red against the black screen. You've seen me. Now I'll see you. The computer shut off with a loud pop, plunging the room into an eerie silence. We didn't dare move. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock and our own ragged breathing. Aaron finally broke the silence. Do you think, he started, but his voice faltered. I shook my head. I don't know, okay? I don't know what just happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The living room windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight, but I felt eyes on us, pressing down like a weight. Let's go back upstairs, Aaron whispered, his bravado from earlier completely gone. We tiptoed back to our room, the stairs creaking louder than they ever had before. Once inside, we locked the door and crawled under the covers of our shared bed, huddling close like we used to during thunderstorms. Neither of us mentioned it to our parents that morning. What could we have said? That our computer talked to us? That it showed us things that didn't make sense? We were terrified, but we didn't want to sound crazy. The computer stayed off for days after that. When Dad finally turned it on to check his emails, everything seemed normal. No creepy messages, no distorted images. Aaron and I watched from the doorway, our hearts pounding, but nothing happened. Whatever it was, it only happened once. Story 5. It was the summer when I was about 8 years old. My family rented a house near the coast for a week, a quaint 2-story place with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch. The beach was only a short walk away, and the town felt like something out of an old postcard. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, but what happened there still haunts me to this day. The drive wasn't long, just a couple of hours, but as a kid, it felt like forever. By the time we pulled into the driveway, my stomach was in knots. Not from excitement, but because I desperately needed to use the bathroom. The house itself looked old but charming, like it had stood through decades of salty sea air and quiet summers. A middle-aged woman with a kind, wrinkled face greeted us at the door. She was the owner and introduced herself as Mrs. Holloway. Mrs. Holloway chatted with my parents about the house, the town, and local attractions. I tried to be polite and stand there quietly, but the pressure in my gut was unbearable. Finally, I couldn't hold it any longer and interrupted. "Excuse me, where's the bathroom?" She smiled warmly and pointed past the kitchen. "Second door on the right, sweetheart." I bolted inside, my flip-flops slapping against the wooden floor. The house had a musty but cozy smell, like old books mixed with ocean breeze. The hallway she directed me to was dim, with faded wallpaper and a single bulb that flickered faintly. I found the door she mentioned, pushed it open, and froze. Standing there was an older man. He was tall and thin, his grayish hair combed neatly back. He wore a faded blue shirt tucked into high-waisted pants that seemed a few decades out of style. His hands were clasped in front of him, and he just stared at me. His expression wasn't angry or surprised. It was blank, as if he were expecting me. Embarrassed, I quickly ducked my head. "Sorry," I mumbled, backing out of the room and closing the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and I felt my face flush. I figured he was another guest, or maybe her husband, though Mrs. Holloway hadn't mentioned anyone else. I shuffled back outside where my parents were still talking to her. They noticed me right away. "That was fast," my mom said. "Everything okay?" "There's someone in the bathroom," I replied. "I think it's her husband or something." Mrs. Holloway furrowed her brow. "There's no one else here. It's just me." I blinked at her. "No, I just saw him. A man. Older, gray hair. He was standing right there." Her face paled slightly and she glanced at my parents. My dad chuckled nervously. "Kids and their imaginations," he said, trying to brush it off. But Mrs. Holloway didn't laugh. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "I'm sure," I insisted. "He was standing in the bathroom." A silence settled over the group. Mrs. Holloway hesitated for a moment, then said, "Let's check." We all went back inside, my flip-flops feeling much louder in the now eerily quiet house. Mrs. Holloway led the way, with my dad close behind. My mom held my hand tightly. When we reached the bathroom, Mrs. Holloway hesitated before pushing the door open. The room was empty. It was a small bathroom, nowhere to hide. A claw foot tub, an old sink, and a toilet in the corner. That was it. My dad even opened the mirrored cabinet and pulled back the shower curtain, as if the man might have been playing some bizarre game of hide-and-seek. But there was no sign of anyone. "I swear," I whispered. My voice trembled. "I saw him. He was right there." Mrs. Holloway's expression was unreadable. She glanced down the hallway, then back at me. "Did he say anything?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "He just looked at me." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't say anything else, but her eyes looked distant, as if she were remembering something she didn't want to share. The rest of the afternoon felt strange. My parents tried to make light of it, saying maybe I'd seen my reflection in the mirror or mistook a shadow for a person. But I knew what I saw. That night, as we unpacked and settled in, I noticed Mrs. Holloway seemed quieter, distracted. She left soon after giving us the keys, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was relieved to leave the house. The following morning, my dad made pancakes, and we spent the day at the beach. For a while, I managed to forget about the man in the bathroom. But every time we returned to the house, that uneasy feeling crept back in, like the walls were watching us. On our second night there, something else happened. I woke up in the middle of the night, thirsty. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavier than it should. I tiptoed downstairs to get a glass of water. As I passed the hallway, I noticed the bathroom door was slightly ajar. The light inside was on. I stopped. I hadn't turned it on. I was sure no one else was awake. My heart started racing as I stared at the crack in the door. For a moment, I thought about calling for my parents, but something told me not to. I don't know why. I just felt like I shouldn't make a sound. Slowly, I crept closer. My hands were shaking as I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the light bulb, the same one that had flickered the day before, buzzed softly. I turned it off and backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet as I rushed back to my room. The rest of the week passed without incident, but I never felt comfortable in that house again. I avoided the bathroom entirely, opting to wait until we were out or using the one at the beach instead. Even my parents, who never admitted it, seemed uneasy. My dad joked less, and my mom checked the locks on the doors and windows every night. Story 6. The autumn air was sharp that day in 1994, the kind that slices through your coat and settles in your bones. I was 19, and it was my first time traveling alone. My dad had been working overseas for months, and I thought surprising him would be a fun adventure. I booked a ferry ticket and planned to rent a car once I arrived. The ferry terminal was bustling when I arrived, but something felt off. I dismissed the feeling at first. Maybe it was just nerves. After all, it was my first solo trip, and I was already dreading the awkwardness of driving my tiny car onto the ferry. In the end, I decided to leave the car behind altogether, figuring it would make things easier. With time to kill, I wandered to a small harbor cafe nearby. The place was packed with truck drivers, and I quickly realized I was the only woman there. Their chatter filled the room, but one man's stare cut through the noise. He was seated alone in the corner, his ice blue eyes fixed on me. Tattoos snaked up his arms, disappearing into the sleeves of his worn leather jacket. His gaze wasn't casual, it was piercing, invasive. I tried to ignore him, but the longer I sat there, the harder it became. He didn't look away, not once. My unease grew until it became unbearable. I stood abruptly, deciding to leave. That's when he got up too. My pulse quickened. I told myself I was imagining things, but when I glanced over my shoulder, there he was, following me out of the cafe. My mind raced. What do I do? I didn't have a cell phone. Hardly anyone did back then, and I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I pretended to fumble with my ferry ticket, acting as if I needed to double-check something. Maybe he'd think I was busy and lose interest. But then, to my horror, he snatched the ticket right out of my hand. "I'm on the same boat," he said, his voice an unsettling mix of charm and menace. "Looks like we'll have plenty of time to get to know each other." Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I was frozen. He handed the ticket back, his fingers brushing mine for just a moment too long. I mumbled something incoherent, turned, and walked briskly toward the terminal. He didn't follow this time, but I could feel his eyes on me. The encounter had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. My gut was screaming that something was wrong, terribly wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I got on that ferry, something awful would happen. I ducked into the ladies' restroom and locked myself in a stall, trying to calm my racing heart. I stayed there until I was certain the ferry had left. When I finally emerged, the terminal was quieter, emptier. I made my way to the ticket counter and asked to rebook for the next ferry. The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. I bought the new ticket and sat in the waiting area, trying to convince myself I wasn't being ridiculous. Hours later, I boarded the next ferry. The trip was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the lingering unease. When I finally arrived at my dad's place, he was overjoyed, and for a while I managed to put the strange encounter behind me. But the next morning, the news shattered any sense of relief. The MS Estonia had sunk in the Baltic Sea overnight. Of the 989 people on board, only 137 survived. The rest, 852 men, women, and children, were lost to the icy depths. The footage on the TV showed scenes of chaos, overturned lifeboats, rescue helicopters circling above frigid, black waters. My stomach turned as I imagined the panic, the cold, the darkness. I couldn't breathe. That had been my ferry, the one I'd planned to board. If I hadn't listened to that gnawing sense of dread, I would have been among the passengers fighting for their lives, or worse. But then I thought of him, the man from the cafe. Was he on the ferry? Had he followed through with his eerie promise to spend hours in my company? And what were his intentions? I'll never know. Maybe he boarded, maybe he didn't. Maybe he survived, or maybe he was one of the hundreds who perished. What I do know is that his unsettling presence, those cold, predatory eyes, saved my life in a way I'll never fully understand. Story 7. They say fear sharpens your instincts. I've always believed that until it sharpened mine too well one night. My name's Jake, and back when I was a senior in high school and through the early years of college, I volunteered as an EMT. Our squad operated just outside of New York City, in a sleepy little village where everyone seemed to know everyone. But on this particular night, I realized that even familiarity could breed terror. The call came in close to midnight, a 25-year-old male with a facial wound. Simple enough, right? Wrong. We were covering not only our town, but 2 neighboring villages. One of those villages had a reputation. It wasn't the kind of place you walk through casually, especially not at night. And tonight, the cops were stretched thin. A fire raged across town, and a crime scene investigation was pulling resources. No police available, the dispatcher said, her voice a little too calm. No ALS backup either. You're on your own. I glanced at the driver, Mike, an older guy who'd been doing this for years. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. We rolled out. The address led us to an old apartment building, the kind where the paint peeled off the walls like dead skin, and the air reeked of mildew and regret. The backyard was wide open, a dark, barren field surrounded by chain-link fences. No porch lights, no street lights, just darkness. Mike pulled the ambulance onto the grass, and we scanned the area. At first, I couldn't see the patient. Then I caught sight of him, a lone figure sitting hunched over on a cinder block in the far corner of the yard, just outside the ambulance's headlights. Something's not right, I muttered. Yeah, no kidding, Mike replied. Instinct screamed at me. It wasn't the wound or the darkness or the isolation. It was him. He sat too still, too quiet, like he was waiting for something or someone. My pulse quickened. Floodlights, I said abruptly. Mike didn't hesitate. He flicked them on, bathing the yard in harsh, white light. And that's when we saw them. At least 6, maybe 7 men emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted with malice. Tire irons and baseball bats dangled in their hands, glinting in the floodlights. They had been standing there all along, hidden in the blackness, waiting. Mike cursed under his breath, and I froze. I wasn't sure if I was breathing anymore. My first thought was to check the patient, to see if he was part of this or just a pawn, but he didn't move. He just sat there, his head hanging low, almost resigned. Then one of the men stepped forward, his bat resting casually on his shoulder. His gaze met mine, and for a second, time stopped. His eyes were dead. No anger, no excitement, just an empty void that chilled me to my core. Mike didn't wait for me to process it. He threw the ambulance into reverse so fast I nearly fell out of my seat. The tires screeched against the grass as we backed out onto the street. Unit 3 to dispatch, I yelled into the radio, my voice shaking. Immediate assistance required. Possible hostile situation. Multiple armed individuals at the scene. No PD on site. Repeat, no PD on site. The dispatcher's response was drowned out by my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Mike didn't stop until we were a block away. He killed the lights and parked, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Jesus, he muttered. What the hell was that? I didn't answer. My eyes were glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting those men to come sprinting out of the darkness. But the street stayed empty. A few agonizing minutes later, we heard sirens. A swarm of police cars flew past us, their lights painting the night in frantic red and blue. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. We waited until the scene was secured before heading back. When we returned, the backyard was lit up like a stadium. Cops were everywhere, weapons drawn, shouting commands, but the men, gone. They vanished into the night, leaving behind only the patient. We approached cautiously, our hearts still racing. The man was still sitting on that cinder block just as we'd left him, but now I could see his face clearly. Blood trickled down from a gash above his eyebrow, but his expression was what froze me. He wasn't scared. He wasn't relieved. He was blank, like he wasn't really there. One of the officers gestured for us to take over. Mike and I exchanged uneasy glances before grabbing the stretcher. "Sir," I said as we approached, "can you hear me? Are you hurt anywhere else?" He didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. I knelt beside him, trying to catch his gaze. "We're here to help," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Can you tell us what happened?" Finally, he lifted his head. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "They're still here," he whispered. "What?" I glanced around, my stomach churning. "They're watching," he said, his voice so low it was almost a breath. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. The cops must have seen the look on my face because one of them asked, "What's wrong?" But I couldn't answer. I didn't know how to explain the feeling, the overwhelming sense that we were being watched, even in the safety of the floodlights. We loaded the man into the ambulance and transported him to the hospital without another word. He didn't speak again. I never found out who those men were or what they wanted. The cops said they searched the area and found nothing. No weapons, no footprints, no sign that anyone had even been there. But I knew what I saw. Story 8. I've been on the force for over a decade now, and let me tell you, I've seen my share of weird nights. I've handled drunks swearing they saw UFOs, tweakers who thought shadow people were after them, and folks so sleep-deprived they'd mistake their own reflection for a prowler. But this one still gets under my skin. It happened a couple of years ago, and every time I think about it, I can't help but feel a chill. It was just after midnight when the call came in. A woman's voice, steady but shaken, reported seeing two people in her neighbor's yard. She described them as wearing masks, one in a hockey mask like Jason from those old horror movies, and the other she couldn't quite describe. It wasn't Halloween, but close enough that it didn't seem totally out of place. My partner Davis and I rolled up to the house. The woman and her husband met us at the door. They were normal, middle-aged folks, not the kind of people who'd be pulling pranks or making wild claims. They told us the masked figures had been standing in the neighbor's yard, not moving, just watching. Then as the couple turned on their porch light, the figures bolted behind the shed. Davis and I canvassed the area. We checked every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing. No footprints in the damp grass, no signs of forced entry, no disturbed dirt around the shed. We chalked it up to someone messing around, told the couple to call us if they saw anything else, and went back on patrol. An hour later, the radio crackled. Same address, same caller. This time, the voice was more urgent. The woman said the prowlers were back, standing in the same spot. Dispatch kept her on the line while Davis and I, along with 3 other units, closed in. We coordinated a silent approach, surrounding the area to make sure no one slipped out. As we moved into position, I heard dispatch relay a message from the woman. "They're still there. They're looking right at me. They just waved." My pulse quickened. Waved? People who get caught rarely wave. Then came the kicker. "They're moving into the shed," dispatch said. I was closest to the shed, crouched low, my hand on my holstered weapon. The shed was small, old, and unassuming, one of those prefab ones you buy at a hardware store. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the night breeze. I signaled to the others, took a deep breath, and moved in. "Police! Come out with your hands up!" I barked. No response. I kicked the door open, flashlight sweeping the interior. The shed was empty, completely empty. There was no furniture, no tools, no boxes, just bare walls and a dirt floor. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and tapped the walls with my baton. Solid. I even crouched down and ran my hand over the floor, searching for a trap door. Nothing. I stepped out and signaled to Davis. "Clear," I said, my voice tight. We regrouped and searched the yard, then the neighboring yards. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a candy wrapper, not even a broken blade of grass. It was as if those two figures had vanished into thin air. We went back to the house to talk to the couple. The woman was pale, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. Her husband stood beside her, arms crossed, looking like he couldn't decide whether to be scared or angry. "They were there," the woman insisted. "We saw them. They were standing right there looking at us. Then they put their fingers to their lips, like this." She mimicked the gesture, her hand trembling. "Then they waved, and they went into the shed. We saw it." Her husband chimed in. "It wasn't just her. I saw it too, clear as day." I glanced at Davis. His expression mirrored my own, a mix of confusion and unease. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "we checked the shed. It's empty. There's no way in or out except the door." "I know what I saw," she said, her voice rising. "They were real. They were there." We stayed for another 20 minutes, combing through possibilities. Was it a prank? Maybe someone dressed up and ran off before we got there? But there was no way they could have moved that fast without us seeing them. Could the couple have imagined it? But their story was too consistent, too detailed, and they didn't strike me as the type to hallucinate or lie. Eventually we left, telling them to call if they saw anything else. They didn't call again that night, or ever, as far as I know. Story 9. I was back in my hometown after years away. The city, with its cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights, felt like a strange mixture of nostalgia and unease. I'd moved away to escape the monotony, but now, surrounded by its heavy quiet, I found myself wondering if I'd outgrown its shadows, or if they'd outgrown me. It was on this trip that I reconnected with James, an old high school friend. He'd been one of those people you could always count on, a steady presence, even when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. But when I picked him up that evening, I barely recognized him. His face was gaunt, eyes darting like he was expecting something, or someone. I didn't pry at first. I figured life had thrown him some punches, as it often does. Over dinner, though, he began to open up. "It's my ex," he said, stirring his drink absent-mindedly. "Megan." I remembered Megan vaguely, a quiet girl with a piercing gaze and a smile that always seemed slightly forced. James and she had broken up years ago. Nothing dramatic, just the way young relationships often fizzle out, or so I thought. "She's been showing up," he continued, his voice dropping, "at work, outside my house. Sometimes she doesn't even make herself known. Just leaves things, messages, little gifts. It's been years, man. I don't know what the hell she wants." I frowned. "Have you gone to the police?" He shook his head, laughing bitterly. "And say what? That my ex is creeping around my house? They'll think I'm paranoid. And honestly, some days I think I am." The weight in his voice made my stomach churn. "Well, you're not alone," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "You need anything, you call me, okay?" James nodded, but his unease lingered in the air like smoke. The restaurant emptied out as the night dragged on. The drizzle had started by the time we got back into my car. We drove in relative silence, the wipers squeaking against the windshield as we navigated the quiet streets. By the time we reached his neighborhood, the rain had turned to a light mist, and everything was cloaked in an eerie stillness. I pulled up outside his house, which was dark save for the faint glow of the porch light. As James opened the passenger door, something caught my eye. A bag tied to my side view mirror. "What the hell?" I muttered, stepping out into the rain. James came around the car, his expression hardening as he saw it too. The bag was cheap plastic, tied in a neat knot. It hadn't been there when we left the restaurant. I untied it, the cold dampness of the bag making my skin crawl. Inside was a crumpled photo, taken in the dark with a harsh flash. It showed a tree, tall, gnarled, and eerie against the night sky. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper. James's face turned pale as I opened the note. His hands were trembling when he snatched it from me and read it aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "I buried our first love letter under this tree years ago. This tree is growing from our love." He didn't say anything else, just stared at the note as if it might burst into flames in his hands. I scanned the street. It was empty, but the darkness between the houses seemed to press in closer. "James," I said firmly, trying to shake him from his daze. "Let's get you inside." He nodded, though his movements were stiff and mechanical. I followed him to his door, watching as he fumbled with his keys. The rain was starting to pick up again, tapping against the leaves overhead. "You okay?" I asked, glancing around. He gave a curt nod. "Yeah, thanks for tonight. I'll be fine." I didn't believe him, but I didn't argue. I waited until he was safely inside, the deadbolt clicking into place before heading back to my car. The drive home was quiet, too quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the roads slick and gleaming under the occasional streetlight. I couldn't shake the image of that tree, or the look on James's face when he read the note. As I pulled into my driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There was a figure standing at the end of my driveway, barely illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlight. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I locked the car doors instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette of someone standing in the rain, their head tilted slightly to one side. I didn't dare step out. Instead, I kept my eyes locked on the mirror, praying they'd leave, but they didn't. Minutes felt like hours as I sat there, trapped by the unrelenting stare of the shadowy figure. Then slowly they raised one arm, pointing toward my house. A chill ran down my spine. I don't remember how long I sat there, paralyzed. Eventually, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness like they'd never been there. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Story 10. It was the dead of night, and I was at my post. The hours were dragging by as usual. The empty warehouse, surrounded by nothing but the sound of the wind against the metal walls, always felt off. The company I worked for had assigned me the late-night shift, mostly because no one else wanted it. The site was far out in the middle of nowhere, just a lonely stretch of highway with a few industrial buildings, one of which housed hazardous chemical waste. The only light in the entire building was a single bulb hanging over the warehouse floor, casting long, eerie shadows that never seemed to settle. I'd been a security guard for almost 6 months, but the nights never got easier. My body was used to the schedule, or at least I thought it was. I'd still get the occasional flash of dizziness or a headache, but tonight it was different. The air felt thicker, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe I was just tired. My sleep schedule was always out of whack, and it was starting to get to me. I'd been awake for over 20 hours, a full day's shift on top of the lack of sleep. The first few laps around the warehouse were fine. My eyes flickered between the shadows, constantly on alert. I couldn't help it. Too many years of bad TV shows where the night watchman always gets killed, I guess. But there was something tonight that made everything feel off. I kept seeing flashes of movement at the edge of my vision, just outside the range of the light. Nothing major, just the usual tricks your mind plays on you when you're sleep deprived. But it was happening more frequently now, making my pulse quicken with every step. I shook my head, telling myself to snap out of it. "It's just your brain messing with you," I muttered under my breath. "Just focus, man." It didn't help. The more I walked, the more those flashes seemed real. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had to fight the urge to check over my shoulder every few seconds. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the usual. Just the wind creaking outside, the quiet hum of machinery from across the yard, and the eerie glow of that damn light hanging in the center of the warehouse. Then as I rounded the corner near the far end of the building, I saw it, a figure. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my eyes fixed on the floor, where something pale, almost lifeless, was sprawled out in a twisted heap. At first, I thought it was a pile of discarded materials, but something about it didn't sit right. The shape was too human. The angle was all wrong. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse hammering in my ears. I took a tentative step forward, my body trembling, adrenaline starting to pump through my veins. It wasn't until I was a few feet away that I could see the full extent of it. A body, a pale figure, lying face down on the cold concrete. My heart raced as I knelt down beside it, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the back of its neck. Cold. I could feel the chill of it through my gloves. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the instinct to help, to check if it was alive. Or maybe it was the dawning realization that I wasn't alone, and I had to make sure I wasn't walking into something much worse than I could handle. But as my fingers brushed the skin of its neck, I heard something. A soft, wet noise, like the sound of air being sucked through a straw. A breath? No, that couldn't be right. My stomach twisted and I pulled my hand back, my eyes wide. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. The sound seemed to echo in my head, louder than anything else around me. Then the figure shifted. I nearly collapsed from shock. The body jerked, a twitch, then another, and before I could react, it turned its head just slightly, enough for me to see its face. But it wasn't just any face. It was pale, too pale, with hollow eyes staring straight through me. The lips were cracked, dry, and pulled into a grotesque grin that stretched too far for comfort. It was like something you'd see in a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist in reality. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I stood up. "What the hell?" I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, but I could feel the weight of its eyes on me. There was no reason for it to be there. It made no sense. I was sure no one had entered the building. The entire area was locked down tight. The only people who had access were myself and a handful of other night staff, none of whom would be lying in the warehouse in such a disturbing state. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. My gut screamed at me to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. The longer I stood there, the more suffocating the air became. The smell of decay, of chemicals, was unbearable. It felt like the walls were closing in. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. "Anyone?" No answer. Nothing. I blinked, and for a split second, the body was gone. I froze again, blinking rapidly, thinking maybe I had lost it. Maybe I was hallucinating. The fatigue was messing with my head. But then, just as quickly, the figure reappeared, right where it had been before. It wasn't moving, just lying there, as if nothing had happened. I snapped back into reality. I had to get out of there, fast. I turned on my heel and bolted for the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty space behind me, too loud, like someone else was running after me. The breath in my chest was sharp, my throat dry, but I didn't stop until I was outside. Only then did I dare take a breath, the cool night air burning my lungs. I stood there for a while staring at the warehouse, but I knew whatever had been in there wasn't human. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.